Hello and welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges and I'm here to bring you my first historical film review set during the Second World War. And what better one to start with than Saving Private Ryan? Out of all the possible films I've yet to review, this one has been my most requested, and I completely understand why. It is also one of my favourite World War II movies, and it was about time I took a crack at it anyway. So for those of you who don't know, this is a film set during the Allied invasion of Normandy towards the end of the Second World War, and it's a story about a squad of rangers sent on a dangerous mission to rescue a soldier deep behind enemy lines.
Some private in the 101st lost 3 brothers and he's got a ticket home.
So over the course of this review, I'm going to be discussing the background behind D-Day, and of course, the real historical inspirations behind Saving Private Ryan. June 5th, 1944. Much of Europe is under Nazi occupation. For 4.5 years, the continent has been devastated by severe conflict, and many have seen their country swallowed whole by Hitler's Third Reich. But the cogs in the German war machine are beginning to crack. To the east, the invasion of Russia has been met with disaster, and the German army is on a complete retreat with the Soviets chasing them. The Allies have kicked the Germans and the Italians out of North Africa and have defeated them in Sicily. But the fighting grows fiercer as they make their way through Italy. With the rugged terrain naturally favouring the Axis powers, a second front was needed to take the fight back to Germany. And in order to do that, the Allies must invade the mainland. Standing in their way is Hitler's Atlantic Wall, a series of fortified concrete bunkers with artillery machine gun positions defending nearly 2,000 miles of coastline, stretching all the way from Norway to Spain. Nazi propaganda declared it to be impregnable. And it was up to Eisenhower, the Allied commander, to put that statement to the test. Hitler's ill-fated decision to abandon his original plans of invading Great Britain had come back to haunt him, as the island now hosted an army of 300,000 Allied troops, ready to flood in across the Channel at a moment's notice. By this point, the Germans had figured that northern France would be the most likely point of invasion, but exactly where was the subject of much debate. Hitler himself was convinced, or more appropriately convinced himself, that would happen at the Port de Calais, the shortest crossing point between England and France, which was why he focused his efforts into making it the most defended. And the Allies took great effort not to dissuade him otherwise, and they actually used some pretty ingenious methods. For example, in the southeast of England, they set up an entire fake army encampment. From the air, the Germans would think they were seeing entire tank divisions, when in reality, they were inflatable balloons. Pretty cool, right? In fact, pretty much everything in the encampment was fake. They even had radio operators whose job it was to all day long give fake orders to fake battalions to move to fake locations, and this absolutely worked. The Germans were completely suckered in by this deception. However, the one thing the Allies couldn't control was who amongst the German military leadership was given the task of overseeing the Atlantic Wall. And unfortunately, it was one of their most capable commanders, Erwin Rommel. Before he arrived, the coastal defences were in pretty poor condition, and his experience of fighting the Allies in North Africa gave him valuable insight of what was to come, and he made an effort to visit much of the fortifications in person, ordering thousands of mines, hedgehogs, tank and boat obstacles to be placed on the beaches. In case of an airborne drop, Rommel flooded many of the fields behind the coastline, creating natural swamps, which was extremely dangerous as any paratrooper who landed in these fields would drown. Fortunately, in spite of Rommel's best efforts, the Atlantic Wall was far from being complete. With the Germans having been deceived that the invasion would happen at Calais, Eisenhower turned his attention to Normandy, where the real invasion would take place. It was then that 5 beaches were chosen. The Americans would take the ones codenamed Utah and Omaha, whilst the British and the Canadians would take Gold, Sword and Juno. In the hours leading up to the attack on the beaches, a massive airborne drop would take place. The paratroopers' objective were to delay any German counterattack before a beachhead was established. And so, after months of planning and numerous deadlines changed due to bad weather, the date was finally set for the 6th of June, 1944, and the liberation of Europe would begin.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
Pretty soon after the movie begins, we are taken to the landings of Omaha Beach. Now, this has to be one of the most incredible and horrifying opening sequences ever put on film. And the majority of what you see really did take place, but it's the little details that truly speaks volumes about Saving Private Ryan's great care for authenticity. Like how we see many of the soldiers vomiting as they head to the shore. To the casual viewer who doesn't know much about history, it might appear that it's simply due to nerves. And whilst yes, that is one reason, but the main one is due to seasickness. Many of the soldiers had been fed a heavy meal before they set off, and you can describe the thinking behind it similar to how a con man is served his last supper before his execution. Combine that with the turbulent sea rocking the landing craft up and down rather violently, and you have a lot of sick GIs. Now there's one quick little inaccuracy I have to point out, and to be perfectly honest, I was debating about whether it's even worth mentioning. But if I didn't, I'm sure it would have been brought up in the comment section anyway.
Clear the ramp! 30 seconds!
Okay, that guy right there should not be American. And the reason why is because all of the landing crafts that dropped off the 2nd and 5th Ranger battalions were crewed by British servicemen driving British landing crafts called LCAs. Why am I mentioning this? Because there are some people who use this scene as an example of how the movie insinuates that only Americans fought in the Normandy invasion, as we never see any Brits or Canadians or any other allies fighting alongside them. Personally, I think these comments are unnecessary because I don't see any point in getting worked up over a few seconds worth of footage. So anyway, as the landing craft approaches the beaches, the movie's back on track with being accurate again. The soldiers on board are absolutely terrified as they can hear incoming mortar fire as it gets closer and closer to the shore. All of them getting ready for what they were trained to do, for the ramp to lower and to storm onto the beach to take out the bunkers. With only a few seconds to spare, the soldiers had no choice but to jump over the side into 10 feet of water to escape the hail of machine gun fire. But as soon as they slipped beneath the surf, another problem came up. Their heavy equipment, now completely drenched, weighed them down like an anchor. With many of the soldiers feeling seasick, some had no energy left to swim to the surface and drowned. This is exactly how the first minutes of the beach landings at Omaha went down. And yet within that same sequence, another inaccuracy pops up. It's when we see soldiers being shot and killed underwater, which is impossible considering how deep they are, and the reason why is because it goes against Newton's first law of motion. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted on by an outside force. You see, the moment a bullet hits water, all momentum is lost, and they just sink harmlessly. In real life, the water was actually protecting these soldiers from enemy fire. So, this is just Hollywood breaking the laws of physics for dramatic effect, and it's not the only time Saving Private Ryan does this. Like in the bell tower scene, the character Jackson pulls off an impossible shot when he manages to shoot the German sniper through the scope into his eye. And the reason why it's impossible is due to the distance.
I didn't see it. 450 yards, Captain, maybe shade under.
The problem here is that at 450 yards, gravity will work against the bullet, causing it to drop, meaning that the sniper has to compensate for this by firing above the target. So when the bullet finally reaches its destination, it'll be from a downward angle, and thus will be unable to pass cleanly through the scope. But anyway, I've waffled on too long about this, so let's get back to Omaha. So when Captain Miller is finally able to swim ashore, that is when we see this movie truly excel. Despite all of the technical nitpicking I just went over, despite all of the inaccuracies this film has, Saving Private Ryan visually recreates the horror of war. We see limbs being blown off, we see a man holding onto his exposed entrails calling for his mother. This is not a romanticized depiction of war, but the ugly truth. This is about as close as we're ever gonna get to understanding what these poor men went through, and never for a second do any of us look down on the soldiers that are too terrified to move.
Move up to the seawall! Sir, I'm staying! Clear this beach, make way for the other! This is all we got between us and the Almighty! Every inch of this beach has been three-sided! You stay here, you're dead now!
Amazingly, despite their natural instinct to find cover and get as low to the ground as possible, with great courage, these men picked themselves up and made their way right up to the seawall. However, they were unable to continue any further as their path was blocked by rows and rows of barbed wire. With incoming mortar and machine gun fire pinning them down and the tide steadily creeping in behind them, a solution was desperately needed to get past this obstacle. In preparation for this, the army had provided Bangalore torpedoes, which were tubes packed with explosive charges. Once the men had slipped them beneath the barbed wire, they lit the fuses and waited for the path to be cleared.
Fire in the hole! Fire in the hole! Fire in the hole! Fire in the hole! We're in business, defilade! Other side of the hole!
With the obstruction ahead obliterated, the soldiers were finally able to charge up the hill. Now, by this point the battle had actually been raging for about a few hours and the Germans were running low on ammunition, and when word started reaching the Navy that some of the men had successfully broken through the German lines, the order was given to provide artillery support. After an intense bombardment, the enemy's will to fight was broken, allowing the Americans to take the beaches, and the Battle of Omaha was over. Now, before I wrap up this part of the review, I would like to point out one scene that really deserves a mention.
What? What? I'm sorry, I can't understand what you're saying! What'd he say? What'd he say?
Look, I washed for supper.
Okay, there are two reasons why this scene is brilliant. One, it shows that the Allies committed atrocities the same way the Germans did, to show the war not in a clear cut of black and white, but in ugly shades of grey, which is extremely accurate. And secondly, what's even more impressive is that those two German soldiers are not German. This is what they were actually saying.
What? What? I'm sorry, I can't understand what you're saying!
Since these soldiers are speaking Czech and claim to be Czech, then most likely they were conscripted into the German army when Czechoslovakia was conquered by Germany in 1939. They would have been part of the Ost battalions, which were military units that conscripted citizens from Eastern European countries as well as from the Soviet Union, and many were forcibly drafted from POW camps. It's a tiny detail, but it's brimming with history, and I absolutely love it. To me, this is real filmmaking here. I mean, not only that, but humble filmmaking, because Steven Spielberg doesn't feel the need to provide subtitles. It's not really required for the scene to have an impact, but when I found out about it, it just made me appreciate this film a whole lot more. So the first 20 or so minutes of Saving Private Ryan is, for the most part, pretty accurate. Whilst yes, I could have gone over a few more technical details, like the fact that we don't exactly get much of an idea of the actual scope of the battle and how long it was fought for, and etc. But the movie's authenticity pays off by showing us what it was actually like for the soldier on the ground, which is an incredible achievement worthy of a historical film. So all of that stuff is accurate, but from this point forward, it's pretty much all fictional. There was no Captain Miller, there was no Private Ryan, or any mission to rescue him from behind enemy lines. The final battle in the film didn't happen either because the town of Rommel never existed. This is just a few of the examples I could give. Now, although none of the plot is true, there are elements of truth to it, if that makes sense. For example, the reason why Private Ryan is recalled from active duty because his 3 brothers were killed in combat is based on a real American military policy. On November 13, 1942, an event occurred that shocked America. In the South Pacific, a fierce naval battle took place during the Guadalcanal campaign. One of the ships involved in the fighting was the USS Juno, and serving on board were the 5 Sullivan brothers. They all enlisted together and wished to serve together on the same ship. But tragically, the Juno was attacked by a Japanese submarine and was hit by 2 torpedoes. When the ship sank, well over 600 sailors were killed, including all 5 of the Sullivan brothers. When the news hit America, there was a public uproar, and to assure families that such an event would never happen again, the military put into effect a policy known as the sole survivor rule. The idea behind it would be to split up brothers serving together so they cannot all be lost in a single battle. And if by circumstance all of the brothers died except for one, then that sole surviving brother would be sent home. And in Saving Private Ryan, that's exactly what happens. Private Ryan loses all of his brothers, and the military has to act on this policy. But the problem presented in the film is that they don't know where Ryan is.
Any contact with the 4th son, James?
No, sir. He was dropped about 15 miles inland near Neuville, but that's still deep behind German lines.
Mac, there is no way you can know where in the hell he was dropped. General, first reports out of Ike's people at Schaeff said the 101st is scattered all to hell and gone. There's misdrops all over Normandy. Now, assuming Private Ryan even survived the jump, he could be anywhere. In fact, he's probably KIA. And frankly, sir, we go sending some sort of rescue mission, flat-hatting throughout swarms of German reinforcements all along our axis of advance. They're going to be KIA too.
And this is the big question asked by the movie. However noble the mission, is one man's life worth risking the lives of others?
You want to explain the math of this to me? I mean, where's the sense of risking the lives of the 8 of us to save one guy?
There is no sense. I'm sorry to say this, but I highly doubt that such a mission like the one presented in the movie would ever be authorized. I mean, due to the manpower and the resources needed for what is essentially a tactically insignificant mission.
It's not going to be easy finding one particular soldier in the middle of this whole goddamn war.
Right, and a needle and a stack of needles.
That's a pretty good point. These Rangers aren't given any real intel about where to find Ryan. The brass just sort of points to Neuville and says, go there and see what you find. I mean, what would have happened if they hadn't bumped into that one guy in Neuville? Would they just be wandering around the countryside for the rest of the war until they found him?
Maybe we should bust up in a couple of different groups, huh? We wander the woods like Hansel and Gretel calling his name. He's bound to hear us sooner or later. Ryan!
That might be a little hard to do, Captain.
Hey, Joe. Doesn't Mendelsohn pal around with Orion from C Company?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, bring him up here, would you?
I love the fact that actually works. But anyway, you get my point. I personally don't believe a mission like this would ever be greenlit, or that the General Chief of Staff of the United States Army would take time to look into it personally. I mean, especially since he was extremely busy overseeing the invasion of Europe. And I feel I can make that assumption based on the true story that Saving Private Ryan was inspired by and how that was handled. Although there was never a Private James Ryan, there was a Sergeant Fritz Niland. Just like in the movie, Fritz Niland also had 3 brothers. 2 of them were killed in the Normandy landings, and the 3rd brother, Edward Niland, was shot down over Burma nearly a month before. And just like Private Ryan, Sergeant Niland was also a paratrooper in the 101st Airborne. In the early morning hours of D-Day, Fritz and the rest of his unit were on board a plane over Normandy when they started getting hit by German anti-aircraft fire. In the chaos, they had to jump out early and miss their drop zone. On the ground, Fritz and a few other paratroopers he was with tried to find a way to the coast whilst avoiding German patrols. After a few days of fighting, Fritz finally found his unit, only to be horrified with the discovery that his 2 brothers had died and that he was to be sent home immediately. Now in the movie, when Private Ryan is told this, he refuses to leave.
It doesn't make any sense, sir. Why? Why do I deserve to go? Why not any of these guys? They all fought just as hard as me.
Is that what they're supposed to tell your mother? When they send her another folded American flag?
Tell her that when you found me, I was here, and I was with the only brothers that I have left. And that there's no way I was gonna desert them.
This is actually quite accurate to how Fritz Niland responded. He made it quite clear that he had no wish to be given special treatment and wanted to continue fighting, to be with his brothers in arms. Unlike Matt Damon though, Fritz had no chance of convincing the army otherwise, because you can't just pick and choose the orders you're given. He was told that he had to go home and that was that. After months of uncertainty, the Niland family was once again reunited with Fritz. But amazingly, that was not the end of the story. It turns out that the eldest son, Edward Niland, had survived the crash in Burma and had been a prisoner of the Japanese for some time. Towards the end of the war, the Japanese deserted the camp, and Edward took the opportunity to escape and was picked up by Allied forces who sent him back to America. And the Niland family had now 2 surviving sons returned to them when they thought that they had originally lost 3. As a movie, Saving Private Ryan is not without its historical inaccuracies. In fact, it's guilty of having many, but to avoid going into too much detail, I decided to focus on the ones I found to be the most interesting and the most relevant. I really do love this film, and I consider it to be one of the greatest World War II movies ever made. And the reason for this is that it makes up for its inaccuracies with its authenticity. Steven Spielberg's objective was to provide us with a narrative of war itself, rather than a detailed account on any one event or persons. To give us an idea of what horrors our grandfather's generation faced. To remind us of the personal sacrifices they made to secure our freedom. Our way of life that we enjoy today is all made possible because of what these brave men did. And this could just be my personal interpretation, but one of the last scenes in the film states this in a very subtle way. What Captain Miller says to Private Ryan could just as easily have been meant for us.
Earn this. Earn it.
Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching, History Buffs. Now, just to let you guys know, this will be my last review for the summer of 2016. I'm going to be taking a much-needed holiday for a few months just to recharge my batteries because I've been working pretty much non-stop for an entire year. I'm sure you guys understand that even YouTubers need a break sometimes. But it's only going to be for a few months and then everything's back to normal. Until then, I'd like to wish you all a wonderful summer and I'll see you again soon.